Let's crack on, because it's been a PR disaster for Labour this week. Nigel Farage has reignited that debate over whether there should be a national inquiry into the rape gangs. The Reform leader accusing the Health Secretary of attempting to conceal the reality of the gangs after he claimed public discourse could risk vilifying certain communities.
Now, that's all as Labour MP Dan Carden has broken ranks from Sir Keir Starmer, joining Andy Burnham in his calls for a national inquiry.
Meanwhile, the Chancellor now says she's going to launch a war on wasted public finances as she ignores growing calls to resign after borrowing costs hit a 27-year high.
And then, as if that wasn't enough, Labour faces turmoil elsewhere as Tulip Siddiq, an MP and a niece of the overthrown Prime Minister of Bangladesh, she's referred herself now to the ethics watchdog amid claims that she's anti-corruption minister, but that she lived in London properties linked to her ousted aunt.
Who's accused of pilfering £3.9 billion from public finances in Bangladesh. Let's talk to former Conservative advisor Charlie Rowley. Charlie, morning to you.
Good morning, good morning.
I mean, whichever way you look at it, this is a disaster.
It is, and it's a number of issues and events that you'd expect somewhere halfway through a parliament, not necessarily still at the very early days of a government. And this is obviously on the back of goods and clothes and glasses that were bought for Keir Starmer by Lord Ali, I think it was, and, taking away the winter fuel allowance. Obviously, many people feeling the pinch now because we've got the cold snap upon us. To couple that with, obviously, economic news that growth has been reduced from 0.3% growth to zero by the Bank of England, and the idea of we're going back to a 1970s styles economy with more borrowing, maybe more taxes to fund the projects that the Chancellor outlined in her budget earlier on, towards the end of last year. So a number of things that are giving, I think, Sir Keir Starmer a headache, and things that I think he'd rather
do you think he is getting a headache over this? Because, I mean, you get the attitude from the entire front bench of the present government that they just don't care what we think, they're just going to do these things anyway. And when asked about it, either they ignore the question, or they just say it's down to the last 14 years of Tory government, or they just say it's because of this huge £22 billion black hole or whatever that we didn't know about.
I think that's absolutely right. And I think there's, the government have got to be careful, because I think you've got to decide how you're going to tackle these things. So I think the Labour government, they've got a huge majority, there's no doubt about that, but I think there's some misplaced confidence in where that majority came from. The Tories lost the last election. I don't think Labour won it. Lots of people stayed at home. There wasn't this ringing endorsement for Sir Keir Starmer and this Labour government compared to, say, 1997, where lots of people, I think, were very pleased to see Tony Blair come in on a new wave of politics. Sir Keir Starmer isn't in that sort of a particular bracket. So I think there's an attitude of, well, we've got this huge majority, so we can do, yes, what we like, what we want, and dismiss people quite readily. But also at the same time, I think you're right, their strategy is also just to say, well, we've got to make these tough decisions, and, you can blame the last lot because they had 14 years to do all this, but failed to do it.
Well, that's an argument if you can see what's working. I mean, the problem is, look at Rachel Reeves, for example. I mean, the tough decisions she made in the budget were all to fix the foundations and generate growth in this country to fund everything else. But of course, it's gone in the opposite direction. So it's all right making tough decisions if they work.
Yes, I think that's absolutely true. And, you've got to go back to what the Labour Party said that they're going to do during the election. So they weren't going to raise taxes, so no increase in national insurance, VAT or income tax. We're now in a situation whereby, she hasn't got the Chancellor hasn't got the fiscal headroom anymore. I think she had about a £10 billion sort of, a comfort blanket there, which is, I think, reduced, because inflation is now up, that's been reduced to about a million, I think, or a billion. So it's not, she hasn't got that much money or that much room for manoeuvre. But they ended up putting up national insurance contributions when they said they weren't going to do it. They said they're going to protect pensioners when they've taken away the winter fuel allowance. So these are tough decisions, but they are decisions nonetheless. And it's now the challenge to, the Conservatives, and to Reform, or any other political party that wants to capitalise on those failings of the Labour government, to say, well, OK, yes, there were failures of the past, but they would have made different decisions. And I think that the opposition parties have got to be able to say that, Labour, you are making political decisions. These aren't forced upon you, but you are choosing to take away winter fuel allowance versus something else, for example.
Well, yeah, great. Except, can the Conservatives do that when they've said we're not going to have any policies for another 3 years?
Well, that's the challenge to Kemi Badenoch, and I think, there will be a lot of people that will want Kemi to come forward with alternatives to actually set out what it is that she's going to do. I mean, she's talked about scrapping the tax that's been brought in on farmers, so she would scrap that. But we haven't heard too much else from her, and that is what has given rise, I think, to Nigel Farage and Reform, who does seem to be on a bit of a one-man mission to obviously capitalise where there isn't that opposition currently.
Well, it's interesting because, Stephen, you were making the point earlier, weren't you, that the way people talk about the Tories at the moment is that they potentially should be the opposition, but it's like they're not really, though. And that seems to be the position they're in. It's like we're all flailing around looking for another opposition.
You're right, I think, because there are so many issues and so many problems that the government have brought upon itself that we're talking about this morning, you would at least expect from His Majesty's opposition, the official opposition party, to at least be part of the conversation about some of these issues. Now, Kemi obviously called for a national inquiry into the grooming gang scandal. That's obviously something that Nigel's also called for, and that's something that I think a GB News poll the other day said about 77% of people wanted, including now Labour MPs, including Dan Carden, as you say, and obviously Andy Burnham.
What do you make of Dan Carden? I mean, he's an MP that he's been around since, 2017 or something. He's someone most of us haven't heard of. He's not a big name. However, when MPs start to break ranks on an issue like this, I just wonder if this is the first crack and we're going to see a lot more, because they must be getting a lot of pressure from constituents.
I think that's absolutely true, and Dan Carden, I think, is a Liverpool sort of constituency, so not too far from Andy Burnham, who's obviously representing Greater Manchester. And I think what Dan has obviously concluded, similarly to Andy Burnham, is that, look, Andy Burnham is a Labour mayor for Greater Manchester that held an inquiry into the grooming gang scandal in terms of Greater Manchester. And the reason why he was calling for a limited national inquiry, but a national inquiry nonetheless, is because he tried to get to the bottom of some of the issues that were happening in his area, but he was unable to compel police officers that are part of the problem of the cover-up and not being able to investigate properly or turning up to... I mean, we've had horrific stories of police turning up to the homes of the girls, the parents of these girls, and accusing, obviously, the girls of simply being drunk and disorderly, and that's it, and not getting to the crux of the problem as to where the alcohol has come from, who's applied it to them, and whatever else has gone on with the horrific events that we've been hearing about. So, as a Labour mayor who's been able to say, I tried to have an inquiry, I couldn't compel police officers to be part of that because I didn't have the legislative framework or the powers to do so. So it does require a national inquiry, and I think people are starting to see that, including Dan Carden. So it's going to be difficult for not just the Prime Minister because he's the Prime Minister, but this is a Prime Minister also who's staked his whole career on being the former Director of Public Prosecutions, someone that should be going after these criminals, and he seems to be taking a bit more of a softer approach, or there's nothing to see here, or we've got the Alexis J review and we'll just implement those recommendations and everything will be well.
Yeah. That's enough, he was very strong on cracking down on people with hurty words, wasn't he, on Twitter? I mean, anyway. Charlie, we've got to leave it there. Thank you very much. We'll see you later.
Thank you. Fascinating too, isn't it? You can predict it. There will almost be a domino effect. There'll be more and more people going one by one.
I should think so.